How did Native American affect the current Russian policy? What if I say that Native Americans were invented by Soviet Union? And also it invented corn, San Francisco. Okay, not literally, let me explain. Even Russian people already forgot that the Soviet Union had own Western movies, and the kids were obsessed with them. Except they flipped the script, the good guys were Native Americans and the bad guys were imperialists. Of course, it had absolutely propaganda purposes, but it sounds harmless only until you realize that for a whole generation this was a ready-made story about identity, enemies, and justice, and how it is related with ongoing war. Today I'll show how one entertainment genre became a political language. Hi, I'm Russian who lives in Europe, and I'm also a student here, so pretty often I hear opinions from teachers, students, and just friends about Russia, and I see how sometimes locals want to repeat some terrible but unknown parts of Russian history and current life in their countries, and I guess I should open them up. Today's topic is kinda funny, but still with not so nice results even for European people could feel right now. 70 years ago, Russians were big fans of westerns, cowboys, and Native American culture. And it's related with LGBT intolerance, current economic inequality, and even ongoing um, political disputes, let's say. How can it be? I hope you prepared your breakfast and we are ready for the journey. This obsession with copying, competing, and reversing the West didn't exist only in cinema. The Soviet state did similar thing in real urban policy. There was a very real ambition to turn Vladivostok into a kind of Soviet San Francisco after Khrushchev's travel to this city. So he looked at the fantastic San Francisco and decided, oh, we need the same, and turned back and said, yay, now we are building our own San Francisco, but better, you know. And that dream was official. After Khrushchev visited United States in 1959 and saw San Francisco, he came to Vladivostok and reportedly declared that the city should become better than for San Francisco. The Soviet state wanted a Pacific showcase city, ambitious, modern, spectacular, and visibly able to compete with America. And you can see the traces of that ambition. A funicular appeared, a very unusual thing for Russia, but something that clearly echoed the visual logic of San Francisco. Hills that Soviet planners normally preferred to avoid were actively built up. And most importantly, the idea of building dramatic bridges across the base was already there. They couldn't fully realize those bridge project in the 1960s. They were too expensive and technically too difficult. But the point is not whether the bridge was literally copied. The point is that the Soviet imagination kept going the same thing. It looked at the West, it felt competitive with the West, borrowed the visual language of the West, and then tried to recreate it under Soviet ideological control. So when we talk about Soviet westerns, we're not talking about some weird, isolated genre. We are talking about a much broader pattern. See something powerful, copy the form, reverse the meaning, and present is your own moral victory. At another point, Soviet leadership became genuinely obsessed with corn. Khrushchev saw American agricultural success, especially high output farming, and decided that Soviet Union also had to become a major corn producer. and it quickly turned into something close to a state fixation. Corn was promoted everywhere. Officials pushed it across very different regions, often with little regard for climate, soil, or local realities. It became one of those classic Soviet moments when political enthusiasm outran practical sense. The idea itself was not completely irrational. Corn can be useful, productive, and strategically important. The problem was the usual one. Instead of adapting the idea carefully, the system tried to impose it from above, at scale, and all at once. And of course, reality pushed back. In many places, the conditions simply were not right. The campaign became a symbol not of modernization but of overconfidence, imitation, and administrative absurdity. So again, the pattern matters more than the crop itself. The Soviet states sees something in America that looks efficient, modern, powerful. It decides we will do that too, only bigger, faster, and ideologically cleaner. And that something goes wrong because copying an image is easier than building the conditions that made it work in the first place. That same logic shows up in agriculture, architecture, propaganda, and culture. And once you notice, you start seeing Soviet Western differently too. And finally, movies. This chart shows Soviet cinema production, amount of movies by years. Chart starts in 1914, when first cinema production company was established. And since 1917, we already can see some activity. Still unbelievably weak, but let's check what we have. We can see one gap here, it's a Second World War. We see this interesting line which wasn't interrupted during the whole Soviet history, and guess what it is? Yes, babam, it's cartoons, yes! This is one cartoon studio once renamed, but anyway it's one, and it was never stopped. It released new and new cartoons even in hardest times. Possibly cartoons is the best propaganda method. I don't know. Let me know in comment section if you want to watch what cartoons did they record in different eras. So let's go back. Whoa, up to 400 movies in a year, and look what happened here between 1960 and 1990. Yeah, exactly, this is Cold War. USSR tried to copy even Hollywood and also TV, and I would say that movies turned to be an excellent propaganda tool, and that's where our story starts. Yes, Westerns. In USSR were also Easterns, but it's a different thing. If you want me to explain its meaning for Soviet propaganda, let me know in the comment section and I will make another video about them. Now we are talking about Red or Soviet Westerns with cowboys, Native Americans and other well-known characters. A very simplified map of the genre. Classical Westerns are basically heroic morality plays. The hero is a principled lawman or cowboy defending a community. The enemy is framed as an outlaw or what older films sometimes called a savage treat to settlement. And the moral is simple: justice, duty and civilization win through courage. Then comes Spaghetti Western in 1916. The tone turns cynical. The hero isn't clean lawman anymore. It's the lone outsider, often a bounty hunter, who is smarter than he's honest. And the moral becomes survival, and the personal code matters more than institutions. And finally, our red westerns from the 1960s to the 1980s flip the story into anti-colonial frame. The hero is the indigenous defender of land and dignity. The villains are colonizers, greedy settlers, soldiers, and capital interests. The moral is solidarity with the oppressed and resistant to exploitation. Keep the structure in mind because the Soviet version didn't invent a new genre. It took the existing template and used it to teach a specific moral vocabulary. In Eastern Europe, Westerns often worked differently as a language for talking about justice, inequality, and resistance. It's important to remember that the Red Western is not only about the USSR as a single country, it's broader, rooted in an Eastern European cultural environment. Communist Western were one of the strangest cultural hybrids of the Cold War. They borrowed the visual language of the most American genre imaginable. Horses, frontier landscape, armed standoffs, lone riders, and then rewrote its moral code. Instead of celebrating conquest, settlements, and the triumph of civilization, these films shifted sympathy towards the colonized and those pushed to the edge by empire. In that sense, they were not simply westerns made under socialism. They were ideological reversals of the Western itself. Across the Eastern Bloc, and especially in East Germany, DEFA, Indianerfilms tradition is a production company, these movies turned the frontier into a lesson about power. The cowboy was no longer a natural hero. The heroic figure was more often the Indian defender, the rebel, or the community under attack. Capital, state violence, and expansion became a real villains. That is what makes communist westerns so interesting. They took a globally recognizable cinematic form and used it to teach viewers a completely different emotional logic. In other words, the genre wasn't seen merely as entertainment, but as a form of counter-narrative. Look at this. My god, it's so funny. Sorry, you see the camera just eroticizes the male body in a way that become hard to not to notice today. Guys just jumping around here and there and demonstrating his muscles and masculine face. Even the guy from other side of the ocean are talking about that actually. It's okay to be gay. In that case, we can see how the broken identity of young boys, showing them pictures like that and blaming for that wishes because late Soviet society was very homophobic. It raises an aggression and it's exactly what did they need from young men. Also important narrative is who the society is. If we see some women, they are presented just as a beautiful dolls, miss their men and waiting for them. In the episodes where something really important is happening, look, here is no women at all. And of course, it's a lie. Native American society wasn't like that. In all the tribes, women were a part of life. Late Soviet society needed to show another message, but is a subject for another topic, how USSR started as a state of equality and turned into something completely opposite. I also want to highlight a phenomenon of intense fandom around the genre's key figures, especially actor Gojko Mitic. Movies and that exact guy became a part of how a generation saw itself, and they worked on the level of emotion and identification, not just the plot. Of course, we again are talking about little boys, not girls. Girls were working, while boys were playing as little Native Americans. So cute. European scholars have been able to study this phenomenon in a focused way. Not Russians, unfortunately, our researchers are busy on other things. For example, in Frame's Cinema Journal's article, The Death by Indianerfilms as Artifact of Resistance, the key conclusion was about social influence are mostly indirect but powerful. On moral level, these films pushed viewer to identify with the underdog, resist oppression, and value justice, solidarity, and courage. In stories that were clean even for children. On psychological and cultural level, they created a shared fantasy of overcoming hardship together. It promotes a mindset of collective responsibility, work hard on kolkhoz, collective farm in Russian, and be accountable, one for all and all for one. Keep your own courtyard clean. And push back against local injustice, while also teaching you not to challenge higher official or the party, because the hegemon is stronger and will win anyway. A kind of learned helplessness that channels resistance downward and discourage defiance upward. As a result, it produced a generation unsure of who they are and unable to recognize their own needs and desires, highly obedient and loyal, brave in defending the interests of their community, even when those wants are largely supplied from outside. Yet not brave when it comes to making a life-defining decision to stand up against something larger than themselves. In my view, this generation is highly convenient to manipulate. I don't blame them in general, but it matters to remember that many of the key actors of New Russia were in fact the children of 1970s. And this is what they ended up leaving behind. Russia's leadership has learned the lesson of the past and is actively trying to make today's children just as manageable, and it's already producing results. For example, in 2020, first higher education share really has returned to 1970s level. Then the trend is telling. But yet kids still don't fully comply. They keep learning on their own. So the dictatorship has plenty of work ahead, like trying to restrict the internet or books. Because one of the most dangerous enemy of our politicians is education, and especially when it's equally acceptable for everyone. Generation who can't accept their sexual needs as well, and who are very attentive to what others do in their beds, and of course misogyny and intolerance to women on the decision-making position is a rule number one how to let war happen. They were taught who they are not, but never who they are. And that turned system cannot give people a real identity, still as and any hope. It gives them an enemy instead to don't lose a power. That's what Russia does with us again. And the older people keep silent, younger people are under the risk of being brainwashed again by already new age of highly stylized performative model of masculinity where you can't know who you are but definitely know who you don't like. Thanks for being here, subscribe for more and share your thoughts in the comments.